Welcome to News from Neptune for March 15th in the 11th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said, quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." That begins by calling things by their right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a state terrorism edition, which considers the source of the massacres in New Zealand yesterday. The massacre in Christchurch suggests that individual terrorism was nurtured by state terrorism. The massacre of at least 49 people in and just outside two mosques in Christchurch is a horror that has shocked much of the world. People are saying, not here. Okay, that's understandable. However, we'll only make progress when we're like, not anymore, not anywhere. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand has condemned the massacre, but the awful reality is that the New Zealand state has carried out massacres of Muslim villages and communities in Afghanistan and Iraq for decades. Where was the condemnation when it was carried out by heavily armed state forces? Labour, National, and every parliamentary party in New Zealand and their members have directly overseen or gone along with the state terrorism there. These activities have occurred under governments led by both of the main parties in New Zealand. When New Zealand state atrocities were exposed in Afghanistan, the previous and current governments turned a blind eye and aided the cover-up. It was the rhetoric and warmongering against Islamic countries waged by the Western powers for the past 2 decades that created the ideological backdrop for far-right attacks on Muslim communities. When the Cold War came to an end, the old communist boogeyman was replaced by the Muslim boogeyman. On top of this, all the parliamentary parties favor immigration controls, which demonize particular sets of immigrants, especially those from East Asia and the Middle East, setting up the idea that people from these regions are less legitimate as New Zealand citizens. In recent years, Labour has a particularly atrocious record in relation to demonizing immigrants, the Labour Party, thereby contributing to the anti-immigrant poison which people like the white racists behind this attack draw from ideologically. Labour, the Labour Party in opposition, when the other party ruled, kept banging the anti-immigration drum. Andrew Little in 2017 claimed that migrants were clogging up the roads, filling the houses, and taking jobs. It's time for a breather on immigration, he said. Paul Twyford, another New Zealand Paul, announced a tsunami of Chinese money was heading to our shores, to New Zealand shores. He claims 60% of house sales in Auckland were to Chinese buyers, a false and xenophobic statement. The people who administer the New Zealand imperialist state can wring their hands and issue their moral condemnations, but a good deal of responsibility for this bloodshed lies with them. And while issuing their moral condemnations, they will continue to wreak carnage in the Third World and maintain immigration controls that delegitimize the presence in New Zealand of the victims of these attacks. And the state will continue to tool up, as New Zealand phrase means to buy weapons in this case. That, of course, won't even help public safety. The state has increased anti-terrorism laws since 2001, intensified its spying capabilities. Its monitoring has been directed at Islamic communities and the far left, but it's the far right that is more likely to carry out acts of mass terror. The group making this statement stands in solidarity with the bereaved family and friends of the victims. And we stand in solidarity with the peoples of the Third World who are on the receiving end of the bombs and bullets delivered by order of people like Scott Morrison, he's the Australian Prime Minister of the Liberal Party, and Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister from the Labour Party. This statement doesn't refer to the fact that both Australia and New Zealand in these matters have their own motives for these actions, but the lead in the foreign policy, the military policy, the killing that it's talking about is, of course, the United States, and New Zealand and Australia have followed along in the lead of the U.S. So as we read the horrible news from Christchurch, we understand that it's in the context of what our country is doing, and we are aware of which the state terrorism of Australia and New Zealand are our responsibility as well. You're listening to News from Neptune. We'll go to David Green.
I've been reading a book called Bring the War Home by a University of Chicago historian, a 38-year-old woman named Kathleen Belew, B-E-L-E-W. I've read it. I spent too much time reading this pretty basic and straightforward book, a narrative of the white power movement as it evolved after the Vietnam War, characters like Louis Beam and so forth, and the Turner Diaries and all that. And this narrative that the author feels leads up to Ruby Ridge in 1992, Waco in 1993, and then ultimately Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City in 1995. It's an informative book, but what I've been struggling with, probably too much, because it's not a difficult book. It's just it's not what's there, it's what's missing. She understands that the Vietnam War, the reaction to the Vietnam War, led to these movements, including the sort of the kind of phony POW MIA movement that the noted historian H. Bruce Franklin talks about in his work. But she starts with our government, but then she puts the government, she every so often she foregrounds what the government is doing, but the government always recedes into the background. She makes the correct argument that these things don't come out of nowhere. She tries to debunk the idea that there's ever a lone wolf involved in these sorts of things, as you just did, Carl, or as that statement just did. But she loses the thread of what the government is doing. I mean, she returns to it in the Persian Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War, in which Timothy McVeigh was involved in, and which shaped his views. And then from there, he was at Waco and then Oklahoma City. But she doesn't ultimately hold the government accountable. And when it comes to Ruby Ridge, she doesn't explore it very well. And when it comes to Waco and the attack on the David Koresh compound, She literally dismisses it in one sentence. There's something really wrong here with the way she's contextualizing these things, because she wants to make the argument that it's all about white power. It's all about the white power movement. Even though she labels the book Bring the War Home, what war is she talking about? A very problematic book, but I haven't been able to quite put into words what is so wrong with it, except that she doesn't deem it her task to really unpack what the government did at Ruby Ridge, except to sort of acknowledge that the government didn't have any right to go after these people the way that it did, and especially Waco, which was a truly heinous crime on the part of the federal government. So that's kind of what I've been struggling with before I woke up this morning. I was reading this book last night and woke up this morning to this news.
It seems to me that it's important to put that into context. Horrifying as the news from New Zealand is, we of course horrified by similar stories in this country and elsewhere, and it's a mistake not to see this context, the way in which the war is coming home, the war in this case being the military policy, the wars perpetrated by the United States primarily. The U.S. has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars around the world since the Second World War, in order to maintain that economic hegemony that the U.S. inherited from the Second World War. And when we see local examples, specific examples of this general historical trend, we should not ignore that trend because we're horrified by the specifics of the particular case. And that is a problem. I haven't heard much about the connection between the death of 49 people in Christchurch yesterday and the cooperation of New Zealand and Australia in the U.S. wars.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the woman who wrote this book, Bring the War Home, is trying to argue for context, including the government context, but then she backgrounds the government context and foregrounds the white power context. And the suspicion I had when starting the book, or when just perusing it, was that this is going to be a brief against Donald Trump. She only mentions Donald Trump, I think, once at the very end of the book, because the book only goes up to 1995. But the narrative, I think, that she's trying to put into people's heads is that out of this comes the alt-right, out of this comes the so-called fascist, the fascist populist right. So she's trying to link these things, and in doing so, she never gets back to what the governmental, genuinely powerful context. I mean, these white power people are a lot of pretty lunatic people, but of course, but and she would probably say, as authors often say, well, that's not the book I wrote, or you didn't review the book I wrote, and that's fine. She did a good research job. She'd been doing it for 10 years. I get the idea that she published it. It turned out to be timely for her to have it published in the last year, when there's all this upsurge in the interest in the alt-right and so forth, and the potential for violence and these movements along the border, along our southern border, and so forth. So, yeah.
And I think it's important to see that this discussion goes on in the midst of the attempt by the Democratic Party to mobilize the outrage at Trump in order to cover over the policies that the Democratic Party and to a certain extent the Republican Party as well have followed literally for years. What's new in this situation is that Democrats face a populist uprising a populist uprising which doesn't fit the convenient left-right, Democrat-Republican distinctions that they've been working so hard to tell us about for a generation and more. What we have here is an objection to the policies of war and austerity followed by both major political parties, but particularly by the Democrats. And the Democrats, they're not stupid, they're vicious, that's different. The Democrats recognize that they have this populist uprising, a populist uprising that in fact brought them Donald Trump, because the people who were objecting to the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the Obama administration, which were the policies of the previous administration as well, finally listened to comments from a presidential candidate, however bizarre, who criticized those policies. And people voted for Trump in America, often because of his criticism of those policies. Now, the Democratic Party, which was wedded to those policies and would have continued them, of course, if Clinton had been elected president, the Democratic Party knew that attacking those policies was out of the question. And therefore, they shifted the question from war and austerity to discrimination and race, and championed those excluded groups, notably blacks, but others as well, and said that they would take care of the problems in American society, which were problems of discrimination. In fact, the majority of Americans recognize, however obscurely, that the problems are problems not of discrimination, but problems of exploitation. And the exploitation continues as the inequality in American society increases and increases at an increasing rate, and finally found a way that seemed to be a way of voting against it. What's happened in the Trump administration is that Trump, for whatever reasons, has been captured by the ongoing policies of war and austerity, and we now have a typical American attack on Venezuela that resembles the state terrorism of the Bush and Obama administrations. Some things don't change. But in that context, we have this attempt to suggest that what seems to be the problem, that is, the U.S. is carrying on war around the world and the U.S. is reducing the life chances of the majority of Americans, that what seems to be the problem isn't the problem. The problem is actually racism and discrimination. Now, the Democrats are aided here by the fact that there are indeed articulate, in a certain sense, white supremacists out there who give a certain cover for this argument. But the fundamental problem here is that we do not have a politics in this country that looks at the things that people really are voting on the basis of, which are primarily war and inequality. And until we do, we're going to continue to have increasingly hysterical outbursts of the real issues through the context of the false issues that the parties, notably the Democrats, want us to pay attention to.
I'm not fully on board with the idea that Donald Trump has been captured. I'm not sure if that's the word I would use.
That's a good point. You're right.
And I mean,
that's a possibility.
I mean, we talk about this week after week, and depending on what happened that week, it's like I feel that. But after the events of the last week, after this budget that was laid out, this defense-oriented social cutback budget that was laid out, after the events in Venezuela, and so forth. It's just like hard to see Trump. I understand what Trump did. I understand his populist instinct that helped him get elected. I just don't know that he has any clue as to how to act on that if he wanted to.
I have no disagreement with that. I don't think it was his populist instincts that got him elected. I think it was the populist mood, the populist movement within the American politics. Trump was the occasion of it because he occasionally said things that sounded that way.
Yeah.
I want to insist that the politics we're dealing with in the United States today are not finally about Donald Trump. Not only is Donald Trump the weakest American president we've had, in the better part of a century, the fact of the matter is that his initial critiques of the constant policies of both parties have been largely abandoned for whatever reason. The problem and the issue is not Trump. The problem and the issue is what the American government is doing, notably in war. The shocking events around Venezuela, I think actually are not being covered over with smooth names that as American wars have in the past, even Iraq. I think that's breaking down, and that's important. But the issue is not Trump and not what Trump does. I think if you want to talk about that, and I try not to, then you have to talk about the way in which the neocon and neolib elements of the American government, what we sometimes talk about as a deep state, but that's uncomfortable for some other reasons as well, have continued their policies from the last administration into this administration with changes that are largely verbal, if that. So the issue is not what Trump's doing. The issue is what the American government is doing, killing people around the world, running state terrorist operations that bring in other countries like New Zealand and Australia, and producing an economy which rapidly increases inequality, and people realize that at some level and look for various ways to object to it. So the question is the policies of the American government, however they might be arrived at within the government, so to speak. However much John Bolton, takes Trump by the scruff of the neck and says you got to kill more people in Latin America. The question is, what is the American government doing, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. In that context, let me read something that was written this past week by Thomas Friedman.
Must you?
I'm sorry. But it's important because, to me, it is, because as silly as Thomas Friedman is, he's taken seriously. And what he says is serious and true in a certain way from a liberal perspective, from a neoconservative perspective. So he wrote a column this week entitled, "Whom to Elect for a Foreign Policy Crisis at 3 a.m. So far, no Democratic candidate is claiming to be ready." So this is Thomas Friedman's message to the Democratic candidates. This is what you have to think about if you want to be taken seriously as a foreign policy president, as Obama was by someone like Friedman. He was in he would go to his Thursday night coffee clutches in the White House and so forth. And what Thomas Friedman writes here is very, very succinct and presents, I think, a ruling class sort of ideological point of view. What he writes, quote, "The post-Cold War era, which has been slowly unfolding since the early 2000s, requires a president to manage and juggle three huge geopolitical trends and the interactions between them all at once." Of course, Friedman always talks in this sort of general, grandiose, sort of quasi-theoretical language. And he relies on this fellow, Michael Mandelbaum, who's a retired political scientist, who's this sort of neocon. Back to Friedman. The first is the resurgence of three big regional powers, Russia, China, and Iran. Each is seeking to dominate its home region and is willing to use force for that purpose.
Good heavens.
Good heavens. This trend is compellingly described in a new book by Michael Mandelbaum, the Johns Hopkins Emeritus Professor of U.S. Foreign Policy, titled "The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth." And then Friedman goes on, if this first trend requires a president who could manage strength, ours and that of Russia, China, and Iran, the second trend will require a deft touch in managing weakness. We are going to see more and more weak states like Venezuela, Libya, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and many in sub-Saharan Africa. Goodness, how did Libya become such a weak state? Either fall apart or hemorrhage lots of their people because they are unable to manage the stresses from climate change, population explosion, ecosystem breakdowns, and the rapid accelerations of globalization and technology. So Friedman is perfectly serious in simply eliminating American context from all of what he's, from everything that he's saying. And then he goes on, for the third trend, the next president will have to manage not only rival superpowers in disorder, but also super-empowered small groups and individuals because of how technology acceleration is putting incredibly powerful, cheap, small tools for cyber warfare, election hacking, and financial hacking into the hands of small units, vastly expanding their attack surfaces. Note attack surfaces, whatever that is, but that's fancy Friedman tech speak type language. And of course, this is, he doesn't mention what's implied here. Of course, is also the lone wolf terrorist or small sect terrorist threat. And then he finishes this part. These cyber tools are all getting fast, cheap, and deep. He likes to rhyme. That is, they can go deeper inside your company, your email, your election, your power grid, or your bank account every single day. This makes them easier to be weaponized by small units like North Korea and individuals so they can have outsized impacts through deep fake, deep surveillance, deep cyber theft. So this is the kind of thing that it's going to be lapped up by the neoliberal, neoconservative establishments of both parties who want to replace Donald Trump with the more responsible person who understands all this high-minded strategic language.
And would run the just same old policies that were run by the Obama administration and the Bush administration. The great fear that Democrats have is that there are people turning up like Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and so forth, who are actually getting elected to Congress, so who puncture this mythology, who puncture this notion that American policies must be continued, those policies that lead to more war and more inequality, and that any departure from them is clearly a very dangerous startup of something that really is un-American in its politics. That much is true, because it's the criticism that has found its way even into the Congress against those policies that have been standard for all recent administrations, and that Friedman is defending here. It's the criticism of those policies that are attracting attention in the U.S. because people understand that there is a good deal of sense to it. Here's Representative Ilhan Omar, Representative Omar from Minnesota, on Obama, an article in Politico. As she saw it, the party ostensibly committed to progressive values, that's the Democrats, and it's hard to write that, but there are a lot of people who think that in the U.S. As she saw it, as Representative Omar saw it, the party ostensibly committed to progressive values had become complicit in perpetuating the status quo. Well, yes, isn't the case. Omar says the hope and change offered by Barack Obama was a mirage, and not an innocent one either. Recalling the caging of kids at the U.S.-Mexico border, which the Obama administration did vigorously, and the droning of countries around the world, the greatest modern terrorist campaign, according to Noam Chomsky, were Obama's drones. She argues that the Democratic president operated within the same fundamentally broken framework as his Republican successor. We can argue about whether the framework is broken or simply put there in charge of maintaining the rule of the 1% in the U.S., but still. She says accurately, quote, "We can't be only upset with Trump. His policies are bad, but many of the people who came before him also had really bad policies. They just were more polished than he was." And that's not what we should be looking for anymore. We don't want anybody to get away with murder because they are polished. We want to recognize the actual policies that are behind the pretty face and the smile. Now, she was specifically referring to Barack Obama here, and the outrage among the Democrats was very great, because what she was saying was that these were the policies that Obama was following. One can smile and yet be a villain, and not just in Denmark.
Yeah, I read a few of the comments for Friedman's article. There were hundreds of them, of course, just to see if there's anybody particularly outraged by this totally arrogant and decontextualized argument that Friedman's making. And very, very few, but a couple of them did mention, in terms of Friedman's idea that who to elect for a foreign policy crisis, a couple of them mentioned, well, there's Tulsi Gabbard, who, along those lines has serious questions about our foreign policies. But to move to another New York Times columnist and what the propaganda, the weekly propaganda is, Dave Leonhardt is promoting Beto O'Rourke as a kind of young Joe Biden, and
that may be true. Unfortunately,
so like we want someone like Joe Biden, but we want someone young. Beto O'Rourke just doesn't say anything really, and so the idea that he would be preferable, I mean, clearly to Dave Leonhardt, he would be preferable to someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who really does have something to say, and what she has to say seriously questions, although probably not to the extent that Ilhan Omar does, our foreign policy. Tulsi Gabbard has some weaknesses in that regard, but she has some serious questions about our war making.
Our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, is skeptical of Gabbard.
Yes.
And he has included a good deal of information of the things Gabbard has been saying for a while that raise issues about that. That's a discussion that should be going on. I'm hoping that he's wrong about Gabbard, but certainly he has examples of the sorts of things she said that suggests that she, as a veteran of the American military, is weak on the opposition to war that we would demand of any sort of serious candidate. Ben Norton, writing about Ilhan Omar, Representative Omar, says Omar is the real deal. She saw through the mirage of the Obama years and understands U.S. imperialism. There's a reason that Ocasio-Cortez, who stays silent on Palestine and echoes the status quo on Venezuela, gets fawning media coverage, while Ilhan of Minnesota is smeared. Well, once again, I think what we need to do is try to sort out these various views. It's remarkable enough that Ocasio-Cortez is saying anything at all along these lines, and that shouldn't blind us to the fact that there are distinct gaps in the account that she's offering. But still in all, that we have any of these people saying any of these things is better than not, and the political establishment, particularly in the Democratic Party, knows how dangerous this talk is and are moving heaven and earth to shut up these people. The Democrats want to run a primary challenger to Representative Omar, she's a Democrat, of course, in the next election. They're really worried about what's happening to the party. The party is splitting in various important ways, and that's the reason we hear the name of the ridiculous Joe Biden again. and the reason that Bernie Sanders takes seriously the criticisms of his silence on foreign policy. So there are possibilities here. I'm not sure what it will mean.
It might be, since we're sort of banging on foreign policy here, it might be appropriate to mention an article in Venezuela Analysis, the website Venezuela Analysis, called Ricardo Hausmann's Morning After for Venezuela, the Neoliberal Brain Behind Juan Guaido's Economic Agenda, by Anya Parampil of Mint Press News. She writes, if you've followed Venezuela-related news on social media, you've undoubtedly stumbled across a video released by comedian Joanna Hausmann, in which she promises to tell you what's happening in Venezuela, just the facts. Despite a title designed to instill confidence in the uninformed viewer, upon closer examination, the facts presented in Hausmann's video hardly stand the test of reality. Much of Hausmann's script echoed talking points outlined by her father, Ricardo Hausmann, in a 2018 article ominously entitled D-Day Venezuela. The piece amounted to a plea for the U.S. to depose Maduro by force, with Hausmann arguing that, quote, military intervention by a coalition of regional forces may be the only way to end a man-made famine threatening millions of lives, end quote, of what Ricardo Hausmann had to say. And then she goes on, the author of the article goes on, but Ricardo Hausmann is much more than a prominent pundit. He is one of the West's leading neoliberal economists who played an unsavory role during the 80s and 90s in devising policies that enabled the looting of Venezuela's economy by international capital and provoked devastating social turmoil. Hausmann emerged among a group of neoliberal economists gathered around the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración, a private university in Caracas. They came to be known in Venezuela as the ISEA boys, quote unquote, a not so affectionate reference to the Chicago boys who were imported into Chile from University of Chicago in 1973 to devise shock therapy policies for Augusto Pinochet and his military junta. During the Chavez era, the Hausmann family was not content to sit on the sidelines and watch Chavez build a 21st century socialism, quote unquote. Joanna's mother, Ana Julia Jatar, Jatar, assumed a position of executive director of Sumate, a U.S.-backed civil society group formed by right-wing darling Maria Corina Machado in order to build democracy, quote unquote, in Venezuela. And she goes on from there. So this is a sort of all in the family kind of thing, part of that's going on. So when you hear this name, Ricardo Hausmann, he's been around for a long time in Venezuela, in this country, in the broader neoliberal context, as the South African writer Patrick Bond has pointed out in some of his work in relation to a more global context. So this is some serious neoliberal, ideological stuff going on here, now playing itself out in a more potentially violent context. Well, not potentially, genuinely violent context along the Colombian-Venezuelan border.
You're watching news from Neptune. We're talking about the news from around the world and the news in the United States of the political machinations that produce death and destruction around the world for the benefit of the American 1%. It's not a pretty story. We have from Jeff Nicholson the following account. He said, I just watched The Intercepts. The Intercept is the questionable, contradictory, peculiar news website. I just watched The Intercept senior politics editor Brianna Gray interviewing Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, as she comes to be called, because people have trouble, I think, with the Latina surnames. In any case, the interview with Alexandria or Ocasio-Cortez some people, including me, have trouble with those names. Jeff says, it was a complete waste of time. Maybe there will be a transcript someday. I'm losing more interest in The Intercept, as there are so few people there now who write or give indications of thinking with appropriate priorities, particularly when speaking about or to people in power. The Intercept has been interesting and contradictory in this way for a while. He says, here's the highlight of the interview. Ocasio-Cortez says, wages have stayed flat for 30 years. Our nation is being more productive and more healthy as a whole, she means economically, than ever before, but that wealth is being enjoyed by a very small amount of people. And the reason for it is not systemic inequality, it's not, or runaway hyper-capitalism, it's not, or the fact that we've taken away all the guardrails of a responsible society, no. The reason is Mexicans, you know, and that's the reason. This is irony.
Yeah.
Ocasio-Cortez is talking about these issues in a way that makes the Democratic power establishment very upset indeed. Jeff points out that that's the high point of the interview, the best Ocasio-Cortez says. The talk, he says, doesn't get better than that, and it gets considerably worse. There is very little follow-up to this in the form of specific policy recommendations. Instead of Gray asking AOC about specific Medicare for all bills she supports and why, instead of Gray asking AOC about a national jobs program bill, instead of challenging AOC's promise to support anything in particular, we get identity politics that eats up most of the remaining time. Here are some of the lowlights, as it were. 1, zero mention of war. The Intercept should be ashamed to let the single largest ethical and budgetary issue go unmentioned when discussing anything with a Congress member. This alone makes the entire interview a non-starter. I suspect this is no accident, like how Sanders' foreign policy is either non-existent or poor. And once again, there's been developments along that line, including a pledge to oppose U.S. forever wars coming from this little group of progressive Democrats this week. A cloud no bigger than a man's hand on the horizon, perhaps, but better than nothing. Intersectionalism gets mentioned in this interview with Ocasio-Cortez, but never defined or explained how distracting it is when we could be having discussions about class. Intersectionalism is a way to talk about race instead of talking about class, which is the frantic attempt of the Democratic establishment, and it's distressing to see Ocasio-Cortez fall into it. No examination of how, in this interview, of how class politics does a better job than race does in explaining where most Americans are economically, poorer than they were, with an ever-widening gap between rich and poor. Plenty of affirming, without evidence, that what Americans face today is inextricably linked to race, with no clarification on what that meant. So Ocasio-Cortez, for all the things she might be praised for, is caught on this Democratic Party attempt to substitute discrimination for exploitation as the major political party that they should be addressing, to use identity politics to counter the populist understanding that's growing, however inchoately, within the American populace. Once again, I think Jeff may be slightly too negative about Ocasio-Cortez, but you can't argue with what he says. He's quoting the arguments that are going on here, and the most we can do is to point out how this is illustrative of what is finally, and in a worthwhile sense, a very deep split within the Democratic Party. Deep split that the defenders of the old order are very much concerned about, and the reason they've called out of the closet and dusted off Joe Biden. We'll hear more about this.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make an analogy. It wouldn't be a good analogy between Jeremy Corbyn and AOC, but it's sitting in front of me here, so I'll give
There's
it.
some germ of truth in that.
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
I know Jeff Nicholson expressed some concern a few weeks ago about the sort of personnel developments at the Real News Network, the comings and goings of people that we tend to whose journalism I think is pretty solid and some less so in relation to identity politics and intersectionality and all that. But that said, one person that I first heard about through the Real News Network, a Marxist economist of Greek origin who lives in Britain named Kostas Lapavitsas. He's been interviewed recently, in the last day or two, by Paul Jay, the executive editor of the Real News Network, and he had some interesting things to say about Brexit. He did a half an hour, and I think they were going to do another half an hour, which hasn't been posted yet. And to summarize one thing that Kostas Lapavitsas said about where Britain is at in this impasse right now. He says, again, Kostas Lapavitsas is looking at this from a Marxist perspective, and from his own background, he was promoting Brexit. He was actually a member of the Greek parliament and of the Syriza party opposing Tsipras by supporting Brexit back 2 or 3 years ago. Anyway, he says, Corbyn is trapped in what I mentioned to you. Corbyn's going to have an equation to solve in the Labour Party, which is impossible practically to solve. He's been navigating a minefield. It's obvious that Corbyn would really prefer a kind of Brexit, but his party doesn't, and he's got a terrible problem because every time he attempts to put these ideas across, his members of parliament rebel. And he's got problems from his party membership, which is actually has become more and more pro-Europe. They've created, that meaning the Labour Party members who oppose Brexit, they've created a complete fantasy of what Europe is, and they've latched themselves onto that. So Lapavitsas talks about this in the context of the Tory party and Theresa May, of course, and the problems that both parties have, both the Labour Party and the Conservative, the Tory party, in terms of those aspects of their membership that support and oppose Brexit as this March 29th date comes up, or this possible extension comes up. And Lapavitsas at least is very firm in saying that the UK should get out of the European Union. He refers to this fantasy that they have of what Europe is and has been.
For all of the complexities of this issue, that seems to me to have been the appropriate left position from the beginning. The notion that the UK should get out of the European Union is buttressed by the observation that the economic policies and to an extent also the war policies of the European Union are what should be opposed. The economic policies of the European Union are neoliberal. They promote austerity. They promote the wealth of the few, the 1%, as we say here, at the expense of the community as a whole, the populace as a whole. And the drive to Brexit is finally an aspect of this populist criticism of these neoliberal economic policies followed by the United States and the European Union. Now, there are other things mixed in there. It's not pellucid by any means. And the arguments in Britain also involve a lot of specifics, including the Irish question. And that makes it difficult to separate all of this out. But the notion that what is finally at stake is a government that can reject the neoliberal policies of the European Union and respond to the populist demands of the population not only of Britain but of Europe as a whole. So the matter, yes, is complex, and the peculiarities of the situation, as David described, falls on the shoulders of the best representative of this critique of neoliberalism, Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party. And I must admit, the campaign, the establishment campaign against Corbyn has just been hysterical. If you think it's been peculiar in this country with Russiagate and whatnot, the Brits have done it even more. And anti-Semitism has been the weapon that they've used for this.
God.
Yeah, it is absolutely incredible. My age is showing, and I say what I say all the time. If you had told me 10 years ago that something like this would be going on, I would not have believed you. Well, it may be in my lack of imagination, but it may also be how unusual the situation is and how cynically the anti-Semitism charges are used in order to support the criminal state of Israel and to tear down the most progressive political leader the British have had in Jeremy Corbyn since Ben died. And
Anthony, you referred to Anthony Benn?
Yeah,
the Labour leader. Yeah.
Anthony Benn, as they would say. Right?
Anthony. So just in passing, I know we don't. This is these are trivial issues compared to the global issues we've been talking about. But it's always fun when local people get mixed up in some of the goings on of the elites. I mean, here I am every week or writing letters, talking here about what I consider to be the kind of corrupt class that runs the U of I, especially the business school, the law school. But overall, the whole corrupt, donor-driven, investment-driven, all these articles. And so here we have, in this context, we have this whole scandal over college applications and so forth.
Amazing.
And I know Carl and I, I'm sure you know and I know a woman named Lisa Maselli, who is the college counselor at Uni High. And she is quoted in the paper this morning, college selection and the application process and this is I'm saying this in a sympathetic way. I think this was it's a sort of a good comment in context of her being interviewed about this story of the local connections to this whole business. College selection and the application process is a journey of deep reflection and self-discovery for the student. In this scandal, parents were throwing money at a guarantee for bragging rights. This warped definition of success and self-worth tied to attending elite schools is so dangerous and misguided, Lisa Maselli said. We are seeing an escalation of teen anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, self-harm, and abuse of prescription drug sleeping aids, end quote. And that's Uni High. I mean, she may be speaking broadly, I mean, kids at Uni High are going to get into college for sure, right? But in this context, I think it's worth noting that what we've created is a kind of a criminogenic environment in which, of course, people are gonna do criminal things to get their kids into college.
Astonishing.
And that's because in college is too important. It's too important in some bad ways and not important enough in some good ways. And that's because the liberal class, the 10% or 20% of the people who run this country, or at least have to go along with the 1%, they have to maintain this myth that there's this meritocratic system, that with all this inequality, there's still this meritocratic system where if you work hard enough and are smart enough, you'll get your piece of the pie. And while doing that, they're completely abusing the notion of what, some of them anyway, are completely abusing the notion of what a meritocracy, at least in the best sense of the word, and I don't take that word very seriously, should be.
I'm so appalled by this the revelations involved in this scholarship scandal, this rather admissions scandal. I'm appalled not because I didn't think things like that would go on. I'm surprised at its extent, but I'm much more surprised at the lengths people will go to try to make sure their kids get into a good college. Come on. We got to get rid of that. The criminality of the American ruling class is individualized here in a way that has to be countered. Here's my plan. Here's how we counter it.
Okay.
We nationalize tertiary education, as they call it in
Couldn't
Europe.
agree more.
We nationalize the entire educational establishment at the college level
Couldn't
and
agree
beyond.
more.
And take it out of the hands of these rich people who own it and run it right now. We provide...
That includes the Ivy League schools,
Oh, of course.
Of
Yes,
course,
absolutely. Yes. Them first. I
Yes,
mean, come
absolutely.
on.
Nationalize them, socialize them.
That's the reason you rob banks. You know, that's where the money is.
Yes,
Well, that's
right.
where the money is in American higher
Yeah.
education, too.
Yeah.
You nationalize them all. You provide free tertiary education, college education, to anyone who wants it. Might require it through secondary school and provide it for those, many people don't want it after that. But at the college level, you admit people to these institutions, which have these peculiar historic roots, by lottery.
Yes.
You don't even sit down and say,
the same
well,
thing.
we need
Absolutely.
a punter and a swim team captain.
Lisa
and so forth.
Maselli's going to be out of work, though. We're going to have to.
Well,
we're going to have to fix
we'll get
that.
a job for her
Okay,
too, because
right, okay.
because what she
Yeah.
says is eminent sense, as you point out.
Yeah.
But people who are available by their own education to that level, their names go into a pool, and people are chosen by randomly, so that you don't get just people from Massachusetts going to Harvard. You get people from across the country and so forth. But you do it not on the basis of these peculiar systems that can be manipulated, as we've been hearing about it, but in an objective fashion, saying, here are the names here's the draw for names for the new class at Harvard and the new class at Podunk State teachers.
But ultimately, it's, the system works for the 1% or at most the 10%.
Right.
Everybody knows that. It's not a meritocratic system in any fair sense of that.
And you can't pretend it is.
You can't pretend that there's anything such as equal opportunity. Whatever we think about affirmative action, which has been something I've supported, it doesn't fix.
Which I don't anymore, by the way.
Well, I mean, and there's
should talk about that,
good reasons for that.
occasionally.
There's good reasons for that, and I think Adolph Reed, who always supported that, has questions about that too. So that's for a further show.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, but this is a context which we need to always, of course, bring back to capitalism, neo-capitalism, and the manner in which the 1% has accumulated all this wealth, partly by controlling the educational system. And of course, sports is part of that
Yes.
higher education problem also.
You've been watching.
Get rid of it.
You've been watching news from Neptune for the 11th week of 2019, a state terrorism edition, which considers the source of the massacres in New Zealand yesterday. As the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow, by coups, the elected presidents of Venezuela and the U.S., because Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance secured by violence of the U.S. 1%. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scollery. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere from The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.